this woman, the Pharisee says, this man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is. Now, I never noticed that the Pharisee claimed to be a prophet. How does he know? That's my question. He says, if Jesus were a prophet, he should know. I want to know, how does he know? Well, you know, people like this, they're always looking out the windows to see what everybody else is doing. I'm sure, you know, he's on the gossip hotline, you know, and he knew who was doing what, and, you know. So he was up on it. And he said, now this Jesus, he must not be who he claims to be, because he would, surely, if he were who he claimed to be, he would know that he's being touched by a sinner. Guess what? Jesus did know. And guess what? Jesus is happy for sinners to come and touch him, because when sinners touch Jesus, the sinners get helped. So he says, but the way he explains it, he could have just said it like that, but Jesus is very subtle, and he gives these little stories. And so he says, verse 40, Jesus answering said unto him, Simon, I have something to say to you. Now, he should have been on his guard now. When Jesus says, I have something to say to you, that's the time to brace yourself, because you know it's going to be a zinger here. So he says, I have something to say to you. And he said, Master, say on. And then he tells him a little story. Now, this is just a parable. It's a made-up story made up by Jesus to make a spiritual point. There was a certain creditor who had 2 debtors. The one owed him 500 pence, the other 50. Now, do we understand who's who in this story? The creditor is God. The one who owes him a lot is this woman who is a sinner. And the one who doesn't think they owe very much and owes him 50, that's like the Pharisee. Does that make sense? In other words, there's a person who is the creditor who is owed, and then there's one who owes him a lot, and there's one who doesn't owe him very much. See? And God is the creditor, and the Pharisee is the one who doesn't owe very much, and the woman is the one who, at least in the Pharisee's estimation, owes a whole lot. So, what happens in this situation? Verse 42. And when they had nothing to pay. Now let's just not be in a hurry here. When they, see both, the thing of it is they both owed him. One owed him a lot and one didn't owe very much, but neither one could pay, you see. Neither one could pay what they owed. So in that respect, they're both in the same boat. Jesus is saying, in effect, it doesn't matter if you owe him a little or if you don't owe very much, or if you owe a whole lot, you can't pay. So if you can't pay, you can't pay. So what does God do in the face of people who owe him a little on one hand or a lot on the other hand, but none can pay? Or none can make it right, in other words. When they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Now the word frankly there means freely. He freely forgave them both. The one who owed a little, the one who owed a lot. So Jesus is basically saying, you know what? You think this woman is really bad, but you know what? You're in the same boat with her, because you can't pay either. You can't make right the difference you have with God. See, there's a God in heaven who's righteous and pure and holy, and you don't measure up, but you can't make it right. And she doesn't measure up, but she can't make it right. So what the Master does, what God does in response is to freely forgive both. Frankly means freely. I think this is a pretty good message myself. Freely forgiven. Now, this is the aggressive forgiveness we call grace. But now, here's the point, Jesus says. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him the most? Simon answered and said, well, I suppose it's he to whom he forgave the most. And he said, you have rightly judged. And he turned to the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house, and you gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with tears, and wiped them with the hairs of her head. You gave me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. Now get the premise here. Jesus said, to whom much is forgiven, the same loves much. And he said, you see this woman? She's loving me much. Now what it means is, she's not forgiven because she loved him. She loved him because she believed she was forgiven. Is that right? He's saying this woman believes she's forgiven, and that's why she's acting like this. Now, where did she get the idea that she was forgiven? You know what? I think she was back there in chapter 5 at that house where the guy came down through the roof and she heard Jesus say, she was probably standing outside. She might have come with one of the Pharisees. She's standing outside. She saw that guy and she saw Jesus said, your sins are forgiven. And I imagine she thought to herself, well, if his sins can be forgiven, mine can too. And she got to thinking about it and said, this is a Jesus who's given out free forgiveness. And she got to believing that her sins were forgiven. So she came to express her love to this Jesus who is giving out forgiveness of sins. Can you see that? Because he said the one who's forgiven much loves much. And here she is demonstrating that she believes she's forgiven much because she's loving much. So just in case she didn't get it, and just to drive the point home in verse 48, he turned to the woman and said, your sins are forgiven. Verse 49. And they that sat at meat with him began to say within themselves, Who is this that forgives sins? See, same old thing again. Verse 50. But he said to the woman, your faith has saved thee. Go in peace. Now, the forgiveness that she received was freely given by Jesus. That's grace. But her faith was when she believed it was true for her. You see that? And she began to express her love for Jesus. But this poor Pharisee, see, the difference between them was only in his mind. He really should have been acting the same way, because neither one could pay, and the Master freely forgave them both. But see, the point is, if you don't think there's much wrong with you, if you don't think you need God very much, then you don't really esteem very highly what He's done for us. But as for me, I think we ought to just raise the level of our estimation of what God's done for us. And that, what that does is it inspires a great desire to love this God that has first loved us. Isn't that right? Let's all stand up today.